This is video 4, Spanning Tree, Basic and Intermediate Features and Configurations. And again, for those of you, if you recently got your CCNA, you've got a bit of a leg up here because a lot of this will be familiar to you. But again, you need to watch the video, you need to stick with the video, don't fast forward through anything that looks familiar, because we're going to be adding to it throughout this video. We're going to be adding to that knowledge base that you first acquired during your CCNA studies. And those of you who are a little rusty with STP, no problem at all. We're taking it from the very beginning. And as you take a look at the whiteboard here, to begin with, we're going to talk briefly about why we need Spanning Tree Protocol to begin with. We'll talk about the role that BPDUs play in the network. We're going to talk about port costs and root port selection and how port costs are determined. And some of this is relatively new information. Some of these port costs have been changed mainly because of the increased speeds of today's networks. So it may have some values for you there that might surprise you if you've read some older books perhaps. We're going to talk about two different ways to change the root bridge election result. You learned one in your CCNA studies, and it's a pretty straightforward method that I personally like to use, but I'm going to show you a second one today because when it comes to Cisco exams, it's always a good idea to know a second way to do something. And then finally, we'll talk about something that kind of got left out of your CCNA studies, and I get asked this a lot in email and during boot camps, that kind of thing, where people say, well, that's fine, but why do I care where the root bridge is? Well, in your CCNA examples, you'd have 2 switch configurations and 3 switch configurations, but as we know, production networks don't have 2 and 3 switches. They've got a lot more switches than that. And we're going to use our new best friend, the Cisco 3-layer networking model, to decide where the root bridge should be placed, and we will continue to come back to that model throughout the course. But before we move on, you know from watching the previous video, actually, and from your CCNA studies about how switches build a MAC address table, and how that when a switch is first added to a network, it has no entries, and the switch dynamically builds a MAC table by examining the source MAC address of incoming frames. And we talked about how unknown unicast frames are handled, broadcast frames are handled, and how known unicast frames are handled. And that's all nice and neat, you know, but for the most part, as we all know, production networks aren't always that nice and neat. And we never really want just one path between point A and point B, especially in today's networks. I mean, redundancy is more of a buzzword now than anything else, but you really do want that redundancy in a network today. We want a second path or a third path to be available when the first one to point B goes down. We've got to have that. But at the same time, we also want to avoid switching loops, because switching loops can quickly overwhelm a switch. And having multiple open paths to the same destination, that's what leads to switching loops in the first place. And that's why we have STP to begin with. Now, STP helps to prevent switching loops by putting ports along valid paths in blocking mode while leaving ports along the best path in forwarding mode. And when things work right and that best path becomes unavailable, then that next best path will start to become available, and will start to, because as you know, by default, it's going to take 50 to 55 seconds for it to be available. The official Cisco word is 50 seconds, but it's actually a little closer to 55. But let's take a look at an example of what would happen in a switching network with redundant paths if STP did not exist, because you can turn it off. And every once in a while, somebody wants to get fancy. Oh, you know, we'll turn Spanning Tree off. You better have a really good reason to do that. I wouldn't do it. But here's one example, and now this is redundancy. We have a lot of redundancy here. We have 3 separate switches connecting 2 Ethernet segments. So even if 2 of the switches go down, these hosts would still be able to communicate. But we better have STP on to prevent switching loops. And if we didn't, let's kind of walk through what would happen here. Let's say that A sends a frame to C. Now these are Ethernet segments, so all the devices on host A's segment are going to see it, and that includes all 3 switches. So if we didn't have STP, all 3 switches would get a copy of that frame on port 01, And none of those switches would have an entry for host A in their MAC table, right? So each switch would then make an entry for that host and say, okay, host A is found off port 01. So that's fantastic. So none of the switches know where host C is yet either. So the switches are going to follow the default behavior for an unknown unicast address. They're going to flood that frame out every port except the one it came in on. And of course that includes port 02 on all three switches. And just that quickly, without STP running, we've got a switching loop immediately, because each switch is going to see the frame that the other switches just forwarded out 02. So the problem is that the source MAC address is still host A. So when, let's just look at one switch. When switch 1 sends that frame out 02, switch 2 and switch 3 would see it and then say, okay, we are now seeing that host A is found off port 02, so we better change that entry. So now not only are all three switches going to end up thinking that host A is actually found off port 02, they will flood the frame again, and the frames are just going to keep getting flooded and never get to the destination, and that's why it ends up being called a switching loop. Now, switching loops are bad enough because frames will not get to their intended destination, but they also put a huge strain on a switch's CPU, and it can actually lock the switch up. Now, luckily for us, this just doesn't happen very often, because STP does a really good job of preventing switching loops before they ever happen. That's what you want. You don't want something to fix it after it happens. You want to prevent it in the first place. And STP all begins with the exchange of Bridge Protocol Data Units, or BPDUs. Now BPDUs, again, Bridge Protocol Data Unit, they are generated every 2 seconds. And the root bridge is going to multicast the BPDUs to a well-known MAC address. Now, you thought you were done memorizing addresses, or multicast address. Here's one for you, and you should know this. This is where BPDUs are multicast to. 0180C2, and the rest are zeros. And the other non-root switches actually forward copies of this BPDU. Now we've got two different BPDU types. The first one is the topology change notification BPDU, and I won't even insult you by telling you what those do. Okay, I will. They notify switches of a topology change. And a non-root can send one of those. And then the root bridge will get it and then let everybody else know about it. The configuration BPDUs are used for the actual STP calculations themselves, and we're going to be talking about these calculations quite a bit during this video. Now, it's through the exchange of these BPDUs that switches elect a root bridge. And the switch with the lowest bid will be the root bridge, and the bid is a combination of switch priority and MAC address. Now, the default switch priority is 32,768. So if the default priorities are left the same on all the switches, the switch with the lowest MAC address will actually become your root bridge. Now, in some smaller networks, you might not care what your root bridge is, but throughout this course, you're going to be introduced to networks where you do care. So you better know how to change that, and you definitely will by the end of this video. You probably already know one way. So the switch with the lowest MAC address is going to end up becoming the root bridge, and to review this, I'm going to bring up a video here, or an exhibit, of a 3-switch network and the root bridge election from each switch's point of view. And each one of these switches is running the default priority, and their MAC address is the switch's letter 12 times. Now, an important fact to remember, too, is that when a bridge or a switch first comes online, it's going to multicast the BPDU to that well-known MAC address because it thinks it's the root bridge. A newborn switch on a network is just like a newborn baby. They come into the world and they think they are the center of the universe. They say, I am the boss. I'm the root bridge here. Switches hopefully will get over that pretty fast. Sometimes it takes babies a little time to get over that. Now let's bring up an exhibit here. Give me just a moment. And we'll look at it from this point of view first. We're going to look at it from switch A's point of view. Now switch A has a bid of 32,768 and then 12 A's after that. Now this switch is going to get BPDUs from both of these switches as we see. And switch A is going to see that the bids that it's getting from both of these switches are higher than its own. And remember, with hex values, you got to know A is lower than B, B is lower than C. And it's the lowest bid that wins the election. So switch A is going to get these bids and say, I'm the boss here, I'm the root bridge. So as this continues, as these three switches that we brought all online at the same time send BPDUs every 2 seconds, switch A is going to continue to announce, I'm the root. Now, from switch B's point of view, this is what's going to happen. Switch B has a bid of 32,768 with all Bs. And switch B sees these two bids coming in and says, hey, switch A has a lower bid than mine. Now, C doesn't. But in this way, switch B will say, okay, switch A is actually the root bridge here. And I'm going to start every BPDU I send from now on is going to announce that switch A is actually the root bridge. And switch C is in the exact same situation. Switch C is going to get these bids, and it's going to look at both of them, and actually both of them are lower than switch C's. So switch C gets the news real fast, hey, I'm not the root here. But it looks at the bids coming in and says, okay, the lowest bid that I'm getting is from switch A, so from now on I'm considering switch A to be the root. Now the interesting thing is here that the root bridge election never really ends. Sometimes we've got technologies like when we talked about the OSPF designated router. When a router becomes the DR in OSPF, it stays the DR until it actually goes down. A more desirable designated router can come onto the segment, but it doesn't become the DR until the current DR goes down. But that is not the case with root bridge elections. Root bridge elections never really end, because now what we've done is added a fourth switch, and it has a lower priority. And notice the way that the bid is actually constructed, that the priority comes first in the bid and then it's followed by the MAC address. So that means that if a switch has a lower priority than the other switches, the MAC address never comes into play. The only time the MAC address matters in a root bridge election is when all of the switches have the same priority. It's a really good exam question. It's a good job interview question too. So as soon as you see that lower priority, you know immediately that's going to be the root bridge, and I don't even have to look at the MAC addresses. So in this case, since BPDUs are sent every 2 seconds, switch D is going to become the root bridge very quickly. Now that sounds like a lot of traffic, doesn't it? It's like, hey, I got this hello time every 2 seconds. Do I really need it to be that fast? Especially if you got a stable network, you're not planning to add any switches to it for a while. I would keep that hello time at 2 seconds. I would keep that BPDU generation at 2 seconds, and you'll see why as we go through the next couple of videos. You may be asked to calculate a bid during your exam, but you also need to know how to see the local switches bid and the root switches bid on the real thing. So that's the show spanning tree VLAN command. We're going to run that now using the network topology that we've used so far in the course with 2 switches, switch 1 and switch 2, and they are trunking over interfaces fast 011 and fast 012. So I'm going to bring that up right here and take a look first at switch 1, and it shows spanning tree VLAN and then the number of the VLAN. I have pre-configured a VLAN 10 here for us to look at. We could have used the default and that wouldn't have been any problem. You need to be extremely familiar with everything here, not just for the exam, but for the real world, because this is really where everything's happening as far as spanning tree goes for this particular VLAN. And you see that, first off, you see that this is the root bridge for this VLAN. There are 2 ways to tell. First off, that the message says this bridge is the root. And what you're going to see here, another way, is that when you see that the root ID and the bridge ID are the same, that means that you're on the root bridge. Now obviously, between you and me, this is the better way to tell. No real specialized calculation needed to tell that this bridge is the root when it tells you that. But what's happening here is this is the information for the switch that this switch considers to be the root bridge. This is the local switch's information. So if they're the same, that means that you are on the root bridge. There's actually a third clue here that we're on the root bridge, and that is that both of these ports are in forwarding mode. The cost really doesn't matter although we're going to talk about that quite a bit in this video. What we're looking at there is that both ports are in forwarding. That throws people sometimes. Don't let it throw you. All the ports are going to be in forwarding mode on the root bridge, and they're known as designated ports. That's what that DESG is for. And you see that hello time we were talking about with 2 seconds. We're going to look at changing that, even though, again, I would advise you against it. Off the exam topic and looking at strictly at real world here, notice that even though the default priority is 32,768, that's not quite what we're seeing here. We're seeing 32,778, and then it explains it's the priority 32,768, and then sys ID ext10. That's the VLAN ID, that 10, and newer switches actually use that to come up with the overall priority. You'll see that it'll take the default priority and then add the VLAN number to it. So I just don't want you to look at a switch later and say, hey, Chris Brown said it was always 32,768. That is the default, but newer switches use this formula to actually come up with a priority. But again, for exam purposes, the default priority is 32,768, and the lower the priority, the more preferred it is to become the root. So we know that this is the root bridge for VLAN 10. Let's go over and take a look at the other switch, switch 2, running the exact same command. And you're going to see some differences here, and right off the bat, you see a major difference here. The MAC address for the root bridge, according to switch 2, is this, but the local bridge ID MAC is different. This is, again, the MAC address for the local switch under the bridge ID, and under root ID, that's the information for the root switch. You'll also notice that we don't see anything here as far as this bridge is the root. So if that sentence is missing, then this bridge isn't the root. Just a slightly off-topic troubleshooting tip here. I occasionally get an email from someone who says, I have 2 root switches for the same VLAN. And I'll look at their configurations, and they will. They'll see on both switch 1 and switch 2, this bridge is the root for the same VLAN. That means you have misconfigured VTP or your trunk's not working, because your switches aren't talking to each other. There's mathematically no way you can have an overall tie for the root bridge election. So, just a little something to keep in mind there. And you see here, again, that the root ID and the bridge ID fields are different, and also one other major difference is that we have one of the ports in forwarding mode and the other in blocking mode, because that's what your non-root bridges are going to do. And you see that fast 011 here has been chosen as the root port for this particular switch. Now, how did that happen? How did that happen? How did this port happen to get selected as the root? The port that switch 2 is using to reach the root bridge here is indeed called the root port, the switch's root port, and it was not picked out at random. There's no real tie here. It's another one of those values that really can't have ties. Now, each potential root port is going to have an overall root port cost, and that is the total cost of all the links along the path to the root bridge. Now, this is actually carried by the BPDU, and that's why that's another reason we still have to have BPDUs sent after a root bridge election. We've already seen 2 reasons. First one was if a new switch comes online, then maybe we have a new root bridge. But another reason is that the port values, the port cost values, are actually carried in the BPDU, and that cost increments as the BPDU is forwarded through the network. Because the root bridge is going to send a BPDU with the root port cost set to 0. And when the neighboring switch gets that, let's bring up an illustration of that. There we go. In this particular example, root bridge sends out a BPDU with a root port cost of 0 because it is the root bridge. And these costs increment as the BPDUs are received, not sent. So switch 2 gets this in, adds its own port cost, adds the port cost of the port that it received the BPDU on, which is 19 in this case, and says, okay, my port cost is 19, and then passes the BPDU down. Switch 3 is going to get it, and the port cost is already set to 19, and switch 3 receives it on a port where the cost is set to 19. So the overall root port cost for that switch is going to be 38. So that's how it happens. And of course, with multiple connections, your switches will have multiple possible root ports, and the one with the lowest cost is going to be selected. So we're looking for lowest cost here. Now, again, I want to remind you the port increments, as the port cost increments, I should say, as BPDUs are received and not sent. And also, this is locally significant only. In this example, switch 3 doesn't have any idea what the port cost is on switch 2. It doesn't really care. And if we continued on with this, with switch 3, no switch downstream of switch 3 is going to know what the port cost was on switch 2 and switch 3. It just sees a total. It doesn't care either, to be blunt. There's no real reason for it to know. But it doesn't have, okay, switch 2 had a cost of 19, switch 3 had a cost of 19. Doesn't do that, just has a cumulative cost. Now, revisiting our example, though, we can look here and see, running show spanning tree VLAN again, we see the cost here, 19 and 19. Well, we do have a tie here. Well, when the root port cost is the same, what happens is that the port with the lowest port priority it will be the root port with the lowest value there. And the default, as you see here on this switch, is 128. The default port priority is 128.x, and .x is the port number itself. Notice that this value of 11 here on the end of this one matches the port number. So the overall default port priority is 128, but then it's going to put that neighbor value on the end of it, 11 and 12, whatever the port number is. So literally, you can't have a tie. So let's take a look then at our 3-switch network that we've got here. And you should be able to, by the time we're done here, we're going to talk about port costs here in a moment, how they're determined. But as a CCNA, as a CCNP candidate, a future CCNP, I would be prepared on the exam and in a job interview and on the job to be able to look at a 4 or 5 or 6 switch network, and given the port priority, given the priority of the switches, given the speed of the links, you should be able to determine, first off, which device is going to be the root bridge. You should then be able to say which ports are going to end up being root ports and therefore in forwarding mode on the non-root bridges. And you should also be able to look at that and say, okay, these are going to be in blocking mode. And we're going to discuss that here for a few more minutes, but you should be prepared to do that on the job and on the exam. So here, very quickly, with all the links the same speed, and knowing that switch A is the root and both of those in forwarding, it would be easy to look at this one and say, okay, I know where the root ports are. And they're going to be the closest ones. But that's because the speeds are all the same. That's the kind of thing you got to watch out for in the exam room and on the job. Because as we all know, not all links are alike. Not all port speeds are going to be the same. So we'll take a more detailed look at that in just a moment, because we've got one more thing to deal with here. And we've got to have a designated port chosen for the particular segment that's connecting B and C, because only one port per segment is allowed to forward frames onto that segment. Now, in this case, you may look at it and say, who cares? And in this situation, you might not care. But let's revisit a situation earlier. Switch 1, switch 2, switch 3. You better only have one switch forwarding frames onto each one of these segments, because if we don't, what happens? We're going to end up with switching loops. So in this particular example, we don't even have root bridges elected here, but when we do, you're only going to have one switch per segment that doesn't have a root bridge on it, and we would assume that another device would have to be the root bridge. You don't want every single switch forwarding frames. That's where you get into trouble. That's where you end up with a switching loop. So that's where the designated port comes in, because on this particular segment between B and C, there is no root switch on the segment between B and C. We've only got two switches, and neither one of them are the root. So one of them is going to have to be selected as the designated port. And the port with the lowest root path cost between switch B's 02 and switch C's 01, one of them is going to be selected the DP, or designated port, for this segment. And it's actually the port with the lowest root path cost. But most likely, they're going to have the same root path cost. So actually then, the port belonging to the switch with the lowest sending bid will be the designated port. And in that case, that would be switch B. Because remember, it had 32.768 with a MAC address of all B's. Switch C's is 32.768 all C's. So you need to know then, first off, how to determine what the root bridge is to begin with. You know how to do that. Then you've got to look at switches, the non-root switches, and say, okay, which one of these are going to be the root ports? Which port on each switch is going to be the root port? And then you've got to be able to say, for such a segment such as here with B and C, you'd have to be able to say, okay, which one of these is going to be the designated port? Because strangely enough, out of all of those ports, we have 6 ports, only one of them ends up being in blocking mode, and it's switch C's 01 port. Because the port that selected the designated port will be in forwarding mode. So that sounds a little odd. How are we stopping loops from one port being blocked out of the 6? But it does work. And as I said, it's an important skill to be able to determine path cost by looking at a diagram. And to do that, you have to know how port costs are calculated in the first place, and what the default port costs are. And I've got those for you here at the bottom of this whiteboard. And I put originally and then either still or now, because some of these were recalculated a while back, and I don't want to assume that you know about it, so I'm going to tell you. Because the change came in on the 1 gig and the 10 gig ports. And you can see that both of those were originally 1, because the formula for calculating port cost on a switch, when you put a 1 gig value in, it came in under 1. And when you put in a 10 gig value, which didn't really exist when 1 gig first came along, it also came out to under 1. So they both ended up being 1 on the switch, but that really wasn't reflecting any difference between a 1 gig port and a 10 gig port, and I think we all know there's a pretty big difference there. So I put the original numbers there for you. You'll notice that the only one that's still the same is the 10 meg port. It was originally assigned a port cost of 100 and still is. You saw on the switches on our network that we were using 100 meg ports. That was originally 10, it's now 19. So you can look at those ports immediately on switch 2 and say, okay, I know those are being calculated as 100 meg ports. And again, the 1 gig port is going to have a port cost of 4, and the 10 gig port is going to have a port cost of 2. And let's walk through a situation like that. This is a good example. Switch 1 is the root, and we got switch 2 and switch 3. And I might ask you, well, which ports on here are going to be the root ports for switches 2 and 3? And with switch 2, you might jump to the assumption that it's the port that's closest to switch 1, and here you'd be right. But don't jump to the conclusion that the physically shortest path is the logically fastest path. That's what RIP does. We're going to leave that to the distance vector protocols for RIP. A hop is a hop is a hop. But we don't do that with spanning tree protocol. We're not talking hops. We're not going to look at this and say, oh, switch 1 is closer, so it's going to be 03. It's not. It's actually going to be 02 on switch 3. And why? Because the path cost To go from switch 3 directly to switch 1, the port cost there is actually going to be 100 because our ports are set at 10 meg. Now going the other way, we're going to end up with a path cost of 38 because all of the ports on that side are set to 100 meg between switch 1 and switch 2 and then switch 2 and switch 3. So what happens is switch 2 receives a BPDU from switch 1 over their direct link, and the BPDU will reflect a path cost, a port cost, I should say, root port cost of 0. Switch 2 will add 19 to that because it's receiving it on a 100 meg port. And then it's going to send that BPDU, it's going to forward it to switch 3. Switch 3 is going to get that, look at the cost of 19. Remember, there's no increment as it leaves a switch. The increment comes when it comes in. Switch 3 gets that one, says, okay, the cost is 19 already. I'm receiving it on a 100 meg port, so I'll add another 19 to it, which actually makes the cost going from 3 to 2 to 1 a total of 38. And the total the other way is going to be 100. So whether it's in the exam room or a production network, I don't care which one it is, you've got to consider the port speeds before assuming that the physically shortest path is the optimal path. Again, we're going to leave that for RIP. We're going to get out of the world of hop count because we're professionals and we're CCNPs, and we're going to look at that and say, okay, what's going on here? What's going on here with the speeds? What are the real port costs here? We've discussed the forwarding and blocking states a bit here during this particular lecture, and you've seen them on the switches, and there are some intermediate STP port states. Ports don't go from blocking to forwarding immediately by default. One very important exception that we will talk about in the advanced features section. And the reason it doesn't happen is because that's another switching loop prevention mechanism. And let's go back over that. It never hurts to go back over these port states. Now the first one is disabled, and it's generally not thought of as an STP port state. If you ask most engineers or most networkers, how many STP port states are there? Well, if they haven't studied for this exam, they probably say 4. I've said 4 for a long time. Oh, it's blocking, listening, learning, forwarding. Cisco official documentation does consider disabled now to be a port state. That simply means that it is administratively shut down. The reason that I say that it's not generally thought of as an STP port state is that your status, your port state, is always going to be right there, your STP port state, under Show Spanning Tree VLAN. You are never going to see DIS there. And let me prove it. I'm going to shut the port down. So it's administratively disabled, and we're waiting for the console message, and there it goes. And now we're going to repeat Show Spanning Tree. And you'll notice that 012, of course, is already in listening mode. It's already become the root port, and it's going to go through listening and learning now on the way to being a forwarding port. But you'll notice that you don't see fast 011 with a DIS next to it. But again, Cisco does officially consider this in their website documentation to be an STP state. Now once the port is open, it's going to go into blocking mode, and you'll see BLK under status. Obviously, a blocking port is not going to be forwarding frames. It's also not going to be learning MAC addresses. It's really not doing much of anything. And the only thing it does do is it does accept BPDUs from upstream switches. Listening is the next state, LIS under status. It can receive and send BPDUs, but we still can't forward frames, we still can't receive frames. Then we go to learning, LRN, and now the port is preparing to actually get back to work, or get to work. You'll see LRN next to under the status column. It's learning MAC addresses in preparation for adding them to the MAC address table. And then finally, we go to forwarding mode. FWD, we're forwarding and receiving data frames, we're forwarding and receiving BPDUs, we're placing MAC addresses in the MAC table, and everything is just fine and dandy. But the problem is, as you saw briefly again when I closed 011, that could have been anything. That could have been me shutting the wrong port down accidentally. Don't laugh, it'll happen to you one day. I hope not. It could have been just physically the connector going down. It could have been somebody in a very crowded router closet or wiring closet unplugging the wrong port. Sometimes it's really hard to see which one you're pulling out. And the cutover from blocking to forwarding is not immediate. And again, it's not immediate for a good reason. It's a switching loop prevention mechanism. And the length of those states is determined by the STP timers. The hello time is the interval between BPDUs, 2 seconds by default. Forward delay is the length of both the listening and learning STP stages. 15 seconds by default. So with that cutover, we have two 15-second delays, not just one. We have a listening stage of 15 seconds and a learning stage of 15 seconds. Now, max age also gets involved in this delay. You'll see this called maximum age occasionally in Cisco documentation. And this is the amount of time that a switch will retain a BPDU's contents before discarding it. And the default is 20 seconds. And I do say here to change these with care, because there are other ways to optimize your network than just lowering all these costs so that when one trunk goes down or one path goes down, the other one becomes available in a matter of seconds. There are other ways to do that. And with trunks, we saw, an ether channel is a really good way to do that. And we'll discuss other methods throughout the course. You really want to be careful about changing these, because if you change the values and they're too small, you can end up with switching loops during the cutover. Because what you might face is a situation where the primary path, the primary link is flapping. It goes down for a few seconds and comes right back up. And that's an indicator of a problem. But if you do that, if that happens and your timers here are set too low, like to 1 and 3 seconds, for example, you could really have a switching loop form on you very quickly. So that's the end of the lecture about changing these with care. But one thing you got to do is you have to change these values on the root bridge for them to affect the network. You have to change these on the root bridge, and if you have a secondary root bridge that you've selected, it's kind of a backup root bridge, then they should be changed there as well. Because it's the values that are set on the root bridge that count. We're going to take a look at this. I know that sounds odd, because you may have practiced with this, and you could change them on a non-root bridge, and you thought, oh, okay, everything's fine. Let's take a look at this and see the commands for changing them. And let's go to switch 1, which again is our root for VLAN 10, I do believe. Yes, it is. This bridge is the root. Let's go over to 6. In the meantime, 5. And reopen that port while we're thinking about it. Let's see how quickly that shows up on our switch. Yep, it's already in listening mode because that's going to end up being the designated port. Actually, they're both designated ports. Okay, well, while that is finishing up then, let's go ahead and take a look at the commands for changing these timers. And note right now, we talked about how this is the information concerning the root bridge, and this is the information concerning the local switch. Well, this is interesting because, we've got hello time, max age, and forward delay listed for the root bridge, and we've also got the same 3 values listed for the bridge ID. It's pretty interesting. I wonder why we have that. Let's find out. First off, let's look at the commands for changing these 3 values. And it's spanning tree VLAN again. And let's look at our choices here. Forward time, hello time, and max age are the 3 that we're really looking at right here. So this is the command to change hello time. And what we'll do is actually up that to 5 seconds. Because you might be asked on the exam, you might be asked on the job, how can we cut down on traffic a little bit, spanning tree traffic. If you cut the hello time, if you raise that, you're actually cutting down on traffic. Again, I recommend you leave it at 2 seconds. Now let's change that for 10, max age, and we'll set that to 30 seconds. spanning tree VLAN 10, forward time, not forward delay. Set that to 20 seconds. So we don't get any messages, nothing dropped. Everything seems to be fine. So we're going to show spanning tree VLAN command. And nothing happened. It didn't make any ports go down or no resetting, anything like that. So let's take a look at this information up here. The hello time on the root switch, on the root ID, has been changed successfully, and it's also been changed successfully for the bridge, because on the root this is going to be the same, because the root bridge of course considers itself to be the root bridge, as it should. So we changed them on the root switch and it looks like they took effect. Let's go over to switch 2 and run the same command. And let's see, this is interesting. The root bridge ID information changed, but the local information did not. It's actually different. So which one is in effect? The one that's in effect, or the values that are in effect, are the ones that came from the root bridge. The only time the local bridge ID settings matter is when you're actually on the root bridge. It is the root bridge that tells all the non-root bridges, this is your hello time, this is your max age, this is your forward delay. Now, one thing I really love about Cisco products is that they stop you from doing things that maybe you shouldn't do, or they give you a warning. If you change the router ID in OSPF, it's going to say, hey, wait a minute, we took the command, but you either got to reload now or you got to reset your OSPF processes. Let's try changing the timers on a non-root bridge and see what happens. I'm going to use the spanning tree VLAN command again. We'll start with forward time, and we're going to set that to 30 seconds. We're going to set them to different values than the root is announcing. Good commands to know. Max age, we'll set that to 40, and it took all three of the commands. Didn't tell us anything about, hey, it doesn't matter what you set these to because you're not the root bridge. Let's run show spanning VLAN 10 and see what happens. Well, the local settings changed to 5, 40, and 30, and actually we had set a hello time of 5 on the other switch, so that would not matter. But look at the max age and forward delay. They changed, but they didn't change here. Because again, if we want to change these values so they take effect, we have to do it on the root bridge. And I sound like I'm hammering that through to you, but it's very intuitive to think, oh, well, I changed them on this non-root bridge, and so locally these will be the values. No, they won't be. You have to change these on the root bridge because it's the timers listed under root ID that actually take effect for your entire network. So as I mentioned too, if you feel the need to change these timers, you may have a secondary root switch. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, but you may have a particular switch where you have decided, okay, A is my root bridge, but B is right next to it, so I want this to be the secondary. We can actually configure a switch to be the secondary. And if you choose to do that, you should change the timers on both your root and secondary root switches. It's a good idea to do it, because then if the root goes down for some reason, the secondary will start propagating those timers as well. So actually, let's just add that. If you have one. Now, again, just one more lecture here before we move on, is that you will see STP documentation out there that mentions lessening BPDU traffic. You may actually see some Cisco exam books or study guides that mention that. Perhaps changing the timers where STP is recalculating a lot. Technically, that's true, but we both know that the exam materials and the real world don't always match up. And in the real world, I would strongly suggest to you that if spanning tree is recalculating, you need to find out why. you need to be an engineer. And I'm not being a smart aleck when I say that. Anybody can change STP timers. Okay, but it takes a professional to go in here and say, let's see what the problem is. We're not interested in just disguising the problem. Okay, so while again, I'm definitely not slamming any Cisco books or anything like that here, but I've read some online documentation where they start talking about, we'll just adjust these timers and that'll help you. Well, it'll help cosmetically, but you're not approaching the problem, and that's what professionals do. We approach the problem, we diagnose it, and we solve it. End of lecture. Let's move on to changing the root bridge election results. If STP is left totally alone, and plenty of networks do this, a single switch is going to be the root bridge for every single VLAN in your network. And the worst thing about that is that why is that going to happen? Why is that single switch going to be selected? Because it's got a lower MAC address than every other switch in the network. That's not the kind of criterion you want to use to select a single root bridge. If you want a single root bridge, it should be a very high-powered switch. And you don't want to take the chance of just leaving that up to a MAC address. And you may just want to spread the workload around. Maybe you got 50 VLANs in your network and you got 10 switches. Maybe you don't want one root bridge or one device to be the root bridge for 50 VLANs. Maybe you want to spread it around. And you can make that happen with one of two commands. The spanning tree VLAN root command, and I put primary after that. You can also put secondary there, as we'll see. Or just the good old-fashioned spanning tree VLAN priority command. The real difference here is that the first command is newer and it is preferred, personally, because it's going to dynamically set the priority to a value that will make it the root bridge for that VLAN. With the priority command, you don't know that you're setting it low enough until you run show spanning tree VLAN again. I strongly recommend to you as a CCNP candidate and future CCIE that you know how to use both of these commands. So let's take a look at both of these commands then. In our current network, switch 1 is always going to be the root bridge right now of any VLAN that we create. Because again, it's got a lower MAC address, we haven't changed any priorities, they're at the default, and maybe we don't want that. So what we're going to do on switch 1 actually, is I have VTP running on these as well. We're going to create some other VLANs first. I'm going to use my favorite method of doing it, which is the command line. Actually, I don't want to do that. Let's look at show VLAN brief, see what we've got. You see VLANs 10, 20, and 30 there. I don't have any ports in them. We don't really need them for this exercise. And on switch 2, we run the same command and VTP. Should already see them, and it does. That's why VTP is so great. So now, if we go back to switch 1 though, and let's just verify what I said there. We know that it's the root of 10. Again, it is the root of 20 because you can see right here, this bridge is the root. Excuse me. And we're going to run the same command for VLAN 30. And we see again right there under root ID, this bridge is the root. So right now, switch 1 is acting as the root for VLANs 1, 10, 20, and 30. And let's just say that we would like switch 2 to act as the root bridge for VLANs 20 and 30, while leaving switch 1 as the root for VLANs 1 and 10. And to do this, we can make it happen with the spanning tree VLAN root command. 20 root, and here's where primary and secondary come in. Now there's no real reason to configure a secondary switch when you only have 2, and that's what we've got here. But if you want to have, say, you've got a 50 switch network, and you've decided on a certain switch as your root, but you want a switch right next to it or in another part of the network that's just as powerful to be the backup root, you can run spanning tree VLAN 20 root secondary, and it will adjust the priority of this switch enough so it doesn't become the root, but it will become the root if the root goes away. Great command. Really great command for doing that, because otherwise you got to really fool with the priorities manually, which is what we're going to do next. We're going to use the primary option here. Use the up arrow to repeat the command and go back and change that for 30. And now on this switch, let's run show spanning VLAN 20. And you can see this bridge is the root. So this is switch 2 is now the root for VLAN 20. We caught O12 in listening mode because we're coming out of blocking, because remember, since this is now the root for this particular VLAN, both ports are going to be in forwarding mode for this VLAN. And if we run show spanning VLAN 30, we're going to see the same thing, and then now O12 is in learning mode. So now, let's go over to switch 1, show spanning VLAN 20, and note now that O12 is in blocking mode for VLAN 20 on switch 1. And we'll see the same thing for VLAN 30. So you got to remember that with STP, not all the same ports are going to be in forwarding and blocking mode for every single VLAN. They're not always going to be the same. We can go in and change them, because right now, let's look at it this way. Let's run show spanning VLAN 10. Notice that both of them are still in forwarding mode for VLAN 10, but the same two ports, one of them is in blocking mode for VLAN 20. So don't get caught up into thinking, okay, well, if a port's blocking for one VLAN, it's blocking for all the others. As you're going to see throughout this course, that is not necessarily the case. So you need to break away from that. Now, again, as I mentioned, it's a good idea for the real world, but especially for exam purposes when it comes to this election process, that you know not only the newer command, which is the one we just used, but also the older command. And that is the spanning tree VLAN priority command. And what we're going to do is go back to switch 1 here and make it the root bridge again for VLANs 20 and 30 using that. VLAN 10 priority. And let's see. Actually, let's do this. We're going to go over to switch 2. Show spanning VLAN 20. We see a priority. See how the priority changed dynamically? Went down to 24,596. And that's because the priority itself was adjusted to 24,576. So if I set a priority of 10,000 for VLAN 20 over on switch 1, it should become the root, right? Because it's going to be lower. Let's try that. We'll just set it to 10,000. And here I get a big fat error because bridge priorities have to be in increments of 4,096. And the switches are now nice enough to show you what the allowed values are. They didn't used to do that. And the multiplication was not that big a deal. I mean, I think we're all capable of saying, okay, what's 4,096 times 2? But now the switch actually shows you that. But that's just a cute little gotcha for this command. You have to enter it in increments of 4,096. So if you ever see in a book or something that somebody set this priority to 10,000, they didn't do it on a real device, because you can't do that. So we will pick 8192, but actually we want to do that for VLAN 20. And we're going to do the same thing for VLAN 30. We'll run show spanning VLAN 10, 20 that is. Yeah, unexpected end of list. That's because I typed something wrong. And you can see already O12 is coming out of blocking mode. It's in learning mode already, and this bridge has already been elected the root. It happens that quickly. So now you know 2 commands that will help you do this. And again, out of the 2, the one that I use in production by far is that first one. Spanning tree VLAN X root primary or secondary, depending on what I'm trying to do. Because for that one, I don't need to know what the current lowest priority is. I mean, I could do a show spanning VLAN and find out, but by doing this, the switch does the work dynamically. Where with spanning tree VLAN priority, not only do I have to make sure that I'm setting it to a low enough priority to become the root, but I have to make sure that I enter it in increments of 4,096. Yet, just for old timer's sake here, the switch didn't even use to tell you that. It would just say invalid value, and you're like, what do you mean it's an invalid value? So that all goes back to our friend binary. It has to be in blocks of 4,096. Now, you learned how to change the selection result, and that's fantastic, but where should we be doing this? Where should the root bridge be located? Well, we're going to go back to our friend, the Cisco 3-layer networking model that we keep referring to here in this course. And of course, we've got core in the middle, distribution switches outside of that, and then access switches outside of that. And the access layer switches are the switches closest to the end user. Ideally, your root bridges should be core switches. And this allows for the highest optimization of STP. And STP optimization does actually go beyond what we've seen here. You can really work with it more. But you really want it on a core switch. And what you want to avoid, whether it's exam diagrams or book diagrams or production diagrams, you don't want to just pick the switch with the most connections to other switches. I see that mistake made a lot. And actually, I created a diagram. It's much like something I saw once, so bear with me here. I'll show that to you. Real world example. And there we go. This is what you want to avoid. You don't want to look at a document like this and say, okay, switch 3 has the most connections to any other switch here, therefore I'm going to make that my root bridge. You don't want to do that. You don't want an access layer switch to be your root anyway. In this scenario, I would want, all other things being equal, for one of my core layer switches, 8 or 9, to be the root bridge. If not, then I'll start working my way out and go to the distribution layer, layers 1 and 2. But you really want to avoid the knee-jerk reaction of saying, oh, okay, this one's a kind of a central switch, a physically central switch, so we'll pick that one. That's not the criterion you want to use. You should want to make your root bridges a core layer switch if possible. If not, then work your way out to distribution, but under no circumstances should it be an access layer switch. Now confess, you got to think that when you learned that 3-layer networking model back in the CCNA that you might never use it again, but it is an important model, and you'll see that importance continue to build, especially later when we talk a little bit about design. So here, in this one so far, we're going to go into a little bit of a exam review here and just hit some high points. First though, a quick command reference, and for this particular section it's pretty short because we have show spanning tree VLAN X, which we went through quite a few times here in this video. And you could see what that shows us, the values for both the root and the local switch there with the root ID. Those are the values that are actually set on the root bridge. With bridge ID, those are the values set on the local bridge, and if they're the same, you know this is the root bridge. And of course, we also know that this bridge is the root because it tells us so right there. We don't get this bridge is not the root on the non-root switches, but if we don't see this statement, we know it's a non-root bridge. You also see the hello time, max age, and forward delay values for the root bridge. You know that those are the values that actually take effect in the network. And at the very bottom, you see the interfaces that are running in this VLAN, their roles, what their status is. Both of them are in forwarding mode because this is a root bridge. You see the cost. You see the port priority next to that. And that's really about it for show spanning VLAN 10. Now, the other commands that we want to look at are really variations of the same command or options. And we've got quite a few here. If we want to change the forward delay, hello, or maximum age intervals, we need to go to the root bridge and we need to use spanning tree VLAN X with that correct option right behind it. Also, if we are going to affect the root bridge election, we can use this command to do so with one of two options. You remember we can set the priority, and we've got to do that in increments of 4096. And if we want to use the other command to do that, the root command will then be asked, are we configuring this as the primary root or the secondary root? So again, it's always a good idea as a CCNP candidate, especially as a CCIE candidate, to know more than one way of doing things. And if I were you, I would know both of those ways like the back of my hand. Enough said. Now, as for a command reference, that's really pretty much it for the basics. Now, as for an exam review, just going over some of the major points we hit in this video. STP is our switching loop prevention protocol. BPDUs carry the bits that are used to elect a root bridge The lowest bid wins, and the bid consists of the local switch priority and the MAC address. And just to remind you of the way the bid is built, the switch priority comes first and it's followed by the MAC address. So if you lower a priority of one of multiple switches, that switch will become the root for all your VLANs. The MAC address doesn't come into play. The multicasting address you need to know for this section is shown there on the board. That's where the BPDUs are going to be sent. Root bridge ports, all in forwarding mode. Don't let that throw you. We just saw that on the rack, actually. Let's go up a bit here. This was our root bridge for VLAN 10, and all the ports are going to be in forwarding mode. Now, the root port on a non-root bridge, that's the port with the lowest root port cost back to the root. And it's a long-winded description, but as you saw in the video, it's pretty simple. This port cost is incremented as BPDUs are received, not as they are sent. And also, it's locally significant only as far as a port cost goes. Switch 2 doesn't have any idea what the port costs are on Switch 1 and doesn't care. So let's take a look. Stepping forward, the port with the lowest root port cost on a segment where there is no root bridge, that's going to be the designated port, and the switch is actually referred to as the designated bridge for that segment. We saw that between switches B and C in our little 3-switch example, and that switch will be the only switch forwarding frames onto the segment, and that's what you want. We saw earlier where we had 3 switches connected to a single physical segment, and in that situation you only want one of those switches forwarding frames onto the segment, or we're going to get switching loops, and that's what STP helps us to avoid. The default port costs, again, some of you may be more familiar with these older ones if you've worked with switches quite a bit in the past, but they have changed. I would know those new values, and you saw the 19 in effect on the 100 meg ports we had on our switches. You know now that the cost for the 1 gig and 10 gig ports used to be the same because of the way the formula was working out at that time, but they've adapted to this speed change, and the 1 gig port will have a cost of 4, and now the 10 gig costs have costs of 2. And please keep in mind when looking at a diagram, take your time. The shortest physical path is not always going to be the best logical path. Quick review of the port states and the timers here. I know you know these by heart. Disabled, blocking, listening, learning, forwarding. I have the 3 timers there for you as well and what they do. You know how to change them, and you know where to change them, more importantly, on the root bridge. And 2 things we do pretty often in this business. Changing the root bridge election, we can use one of 2 different commands, the spanning tree VLAN X root command, and then we have to specify whether it's going to be the primary root or the secondary root for that VLAN. Or we can use the old-fashioned command, the priority command, and here that X must be in increments of 4096. And we talked about why we would ever use this in the first place. Well, if we just leave it up to the defaults, the switch with the lowest MAC address in our network is going to be the root bridge for all the VLANs, and we may not want that. And one reason we may not want that is if we're adhering to Cisco's 3-layer model. We've got core switches, we've got distribution switches, we've got access switches, and the access switches are the ones closest to the users. We don't want those to be our root bridges. We would like our root bridges to be in the core, but if that's not possible, we'll put them in the distribution layer. But we want to avoid the access layer at all costs. You'll see why in the next video, because we've got quite a few advanced STP features to go over. And these are going to go along with campus networks, and we're going to talk about PortFast, which is an old friend of yours from your earlier studies, but quite a few more STP features here, and we will address those in the next video. I'll see you there. Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Chris Bryant, CCIE number 12933, and this is video 4, Spanning Tree, Basic and Intermediate Features and Configurations. And again, for those of you, if you recently got your CCNA, you've got a bit of a leg up here because a lot of this will be familiar to you. But again, you need to watch the video, you need to stick with the video, don't fast forward through anything that looks familiar, because we're going to be adding to it throughout this video. We're going to be adding to that knowledge base that you first acquired during your CCNA studies. And those of you who are a little rusty with STP, no problem at all. We're taking it from the very beginning. And as you take a look at the whiteboard here, to begin with, we're going to talk briefly about why we need spanning tree protocol to begin with. We'll talk about the role that BPDUs play in the network. We're going to talk about port costs and root port selection and how port costs are determined. And some of this is relatively new information. Some of these port costs have been changed mainly because of the increased speeds of today's networks. So it may have some values for you there that might surprise you if you've read some older books perhaps. We're going to talk about two different ways to change the root bridge election result. You learned one in your CCNA studies, and it's a pretty straightforward method that I personally like to use, but I'm going to show you a second one today because when it comes to Cisco exams, it's always a good idea to know a second way to do something. And then finally, we'll talk about something that kind of got left out of your CCNA studies, and I get asked this a lot in email and during boot camps, that kind of thing, where people say, well, that's fine, but why do I care where the root bridge is? Well, in your CCNA examples, you'd have 2 switch configurations and 3 switch configurations, but as we know, production networks don't have 2 and 3 switches. They've got a lot more switches than that. And we're going to use our new best friend, the Cisco 3-layer networking model, to decide where the root bridge should be placed, and we will continue to come back to that model throughout the course. But before we move on, you know from watching the previous video, actually, and from your CCNA studies about how switches build a MAC address table, and how that when a switch is first added to a network, it has no entries, and the switch dynamically builds a MAC table by examining the source MAC address of incoming frames. And we talked about how unknown unicast frames are handled, broadcast frames are handled, and how known unicast frames are handled. And that's all nice and neat, you know, but for the most part, as we all know, production networks aren't always that nice and neat. And we never really want just one path between point A and point B, especially in today's networks. I mean, redundancy is more of a buzzword now than anything else, but you really do want that redundancy in a network today. We want a second path or a third path to be available when the first one to point B goes down. We've got to have that. But at the same time, we also want to avoid switching loops, because switching loops can quickly overwhelm a switch. And having multiple open paths to the same destination, that's what leads to switching loops in the first place. And that's why we have STP to begin with. Now, STP helps to prevent switching loops by putting ports along valid paths in blocking mode while leaving ports along the best path in forwarding mode. And when things work right and that best path becomes unavailable, then that next best path will start to become available. And